My name is Leslie Velasquez, and I work for El Puente. My role at El Puente is Environmental Justice Program Coordinator. So my organization has been, and my community has been heavily impacted by COVID-19. We've actually seen a lot of deaths in the families that we serve. And we predominantly serve a low income Latinx and African American community. And those are tend to be people of color, Black and brown people tend to be hit hardest by COVID-19, especially in New York City. We've been responding in a lot of different ways. At first, we were just reaching out to all the families we serve, calling them, checking in, making sure they're okay. And then we sort of followed up by, we created a resource guide. So we called people and just asking what they need and connecting them to different resources around the city, whether that be food or, getting like Wi-Fi or a laptop for school, things like that. And now we're doing a lot of like direct response stuff. So we're helping to administer like food giveaways in a food bank at two NYCHA houses. And we're also, during the summer, we're going to be doing some more actual like fundraising for the undocumented families that we serve because they're not eligible for government stimulus checks. So they're being hit extremely hard by this. And hopefully going to be helping some people out, as well as just continuing our work in sort of networking around different resources and services for the city to be able to train people to help other people like apply for unemployment benefits or different things like that. So yeah, it's a very holistic approach. So the resource guide, I worked on that actually with some of my other coworkers. And it was just compiling a lot of sort of the other resources that we'd seen from other guides. But then also, like getting information from city websites and stuff and just breaking that down and making it more like understandable so that community members could like look at it and quickly just kind of gather information that they needed. But also it had things like, funds for restaurant workers, for artists. So just like trying to keep it continually updated is something that we're working on. And so that we can like distribute it in like our food banks or, through calls or online. Yeah, so it has like a multitude of resources on it. I think we've learned a lot of lessons through COVID-19 and how those can apply to the climate crisis. For example, I think, well, we've seen like studies, there's one from Harvard about how communities living in areas with poor air quality have been more affected by COVID-19 with higher infection and death rates. And I actually saw a study, I think the other day, I forget where it was from, but just connecting the fact that communities who live in areas with a lot of environmental hazards tend to have higher COVID-19 infection and death rates. And that like completely makes sense because these people live in polluted areas and all of those factors together can cause chronic health conditions that are just going to make you more vulnerable to getting sick in general. And I think through this, we've seen, that our government, both at like the federal and like state and local level is like woefully unequipped to quickly respond to crises. And like in a lot of cases, actually like reluctant to do that. So at least in our org, we've kind of learned that a lot of the work that we need to do going forward in terms of resiliency for the climate crisis and for future pandemics like this, because they will, become all the more common, is that we really need to do the work ourselves. And of course, like we want to pressure our government to stand up and do more, and they should. But we, need to be there for our community in the event that they won't be. And we need to connect to other partner organizations and really like build these networks of resilience and resources. And that this has to be like a coordinated approach, because I think in the beginning, a lot of people were just kind of off doing their own thing and there wasn't necessarily like a lot of communication because people were just responding very quickly. But we can all, if we like coordinate and work together, it'll be a lot more of an effective response. And also just that, like I was saying before, with all these sort of environmental hazards, environmental justice issues that make people more vulnerable to not just, climate change, but pandemics like this and other crises. is that that is the result of like decades and decades of government disinvestment, and all of these like factors come together, and they're all like systemic issues that really need to be addressed. And so just continuing to hammer that point home, like even for example, we learned through this, and having our children having to do remote learning, is that a lot of our families don't actually have Wi-Fi at home or computers. So, you know, that's like basically at this point a necessity to survive in the modern world. And that's not something that people think about or think. I think a lot of people who come from a privileged place don't even consider not having Wi-Fi as like a thing that people go through. And the fact that, you know, a lot of people in our community are also, they're essential workers, so they're going to be more vulnerable because of that too. Yeah. People can support our efforts in a lot of ways. At Puente, we actually, we've like never really fundraised before, but we're starting to do that now. So you can donate directly to our organization. And like I said before, we are doing a lot of direct support work this summer and going forward, and especially helping our undocumented families, but just our families in general, because they really are suffering. A lot of them have lost people, a lot of them have lost their jobs, and they're just going through a lot. But also a major thing that we're working on, that we've been working on for a while, but now we're kind of adapting to respond to this crisis, is that we've developed a call to action, we call it. And that's a 5-point policy platform that was originally part of our AIR campaign, and it specifically was developed with students actually from the New School, as well as the Pratt Institute and community members. And it comes up with like urban design and policy solutions to improve air quality and just sort of the environmental conditions of our neighborhood. But, you know, after COVID happened, we started realizing sort of the connections between COVID and environmental justice issues, and it's expanded to be very much like a holistic sort of set of policies to improve community development and health in general. And so it includes things like what I was mentioning before about developing a community-wide response, working with different partners and across sectors and with elected leaders, as well as, you know, continue to help our community by referring them to resources and training community members to be able to guide other community members through sort of these processes to be able to get services. And yeah, it's just kind of really tying COVID-19 and the crisis and all of that that has revealed about the gaps in sort of our community and our ability to respond to these things, to air quality and environmental issues in general. And so we have a petition that really outlines all of those policies, and people can sign on to it. It's on change.org, and I'm sure we can share it. But learning more, and then there's also different ways to just get involved with our campaign for our air going forward. We're about to start phase 2, which is really about mobilizing community members and elected leaders and building a coalition to, you know, implement and advocate for the policies and the call to action. So that's a really good way to get involved too. I guess sort of the last thing that I would highlight, and that, you know, I think a lot of people understand, but it's really just important to, I think, as like a primary lens to sort of view this, is that it's affecting, you know, people who are already marginalized the most. Like people of color and low income communities are the ones that are hurting the most, that are losing family members through this crisis. And I feel like at first there was sort of this narrative of like, oh, this is like the great equalizer, like, you know, pandemics don't discriminate. But when you have, you know, decades and centuries of disinvestment and oppression through government policies, like, of course, this is going to hurt people the most, who have been the most harmed by that decades of disinvestment in those policies. So, you know, we really have to apply like a lens of justice and inequity, like racially, economically, all of those things to viewing and understanding this crisis.